Good afternoon, everyone. Your Excellencies, the Ambassadors of Japan, High Commissioner of South Africa, other members of the Diplomatic Corps, Ms. Gail Guy, former Trinidad and Tobago diplomat, our distinguished guest speaker, Dr. Cary Fraser, Professor of Government and Justice Studies at the Appalachian State University in North Carolina, members of the U.W.I community, both staff and students, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to all of you, and especially to our visiting lecturer, Dr. Fraser, who has traveled a long way at a busy time in his own university semester to be with us today. I am particularly gratified that he accepted our invitation for 3 reasons. The first is that he is my very good friend. I have known him since I was a student here in the diploma program. He was a master's student. Gail was also one of my colleagues in the diploma program, and I'm not going to tell you all how long ago that was, but it was a long time ago. And he has been a very good friend and colleague for many years. We did our PhDs together in Geneva, and I'm delighted that Cary accepted our invitation to be here today. The second very good reason is that Dr. Fraser has worked for many years on US politics and foreign policy matters. He did his PhD thesis on such themes. He is especially insightful on US-Caribbean relations, and he can offer us fascinating analyses of the dynamics of the present political season in the United States and the possible implications for our region. And the third is that Cary is one of this institute's most loyal alumni, and one who has distinguished himself in his higher education career in North America and in the Caribbean. One of the Institute of International Relations' major objectives, particularly in our current strategic plan, is to strengthen links with our alumni community, of whom we are justifiably very proud. Our alumni bring us a wealth of knowledge, professional expertise, influence in high places, contributions of resources of many kinds, and formally or informally, they can be a source of mentorship for our students and for our junior alumni. They can provide the present day Institute of International Relations and Diplomatic Academy with valuable advice on strategies for the future. We view our alumni as one of our most valuable assets. So I am especially pleased that our first major event for semester 2 of this year is not only a lecture on a topic of major interest to Trinidad and the rest of the Caribbean, but it is being delivered by one of our own. Welcome home, Cary, and thank you for being here with us today. For the record, I'd like to add that this week features in our events not 1, but 2 prominent alumni of the Institute. Please put in your diaries that on Thursday afternoon, there will be a book launch here of the autobiography written by His Excellency Dr. Christopher Hackett, who is the permanent representative of Barbados to the United Nations in New York. We are also very pleased that we'll be able to welcome back Dr. Hackett to the space where he did his graduate diploma in international relations quite a while back, even before I did mine. Without any further ado, I wish for all of us a very stimulating afternoon, both the lecture and our responses to Dr. Fraser. As always, we have some liquid refreshments at the back of the room, and you are cordially invited to help yourself whenever you wish to. And without any more ado, apart from welcoming the High Commissioner of India, welcome, sir, I call on Dr. Montoot to now formally introduce our speaker.
Good afternoon. All protocols having been observed, it is my pleasure to have been asked to introduce our special guest speaker to deliver an address on U.S.-Caribbean relations in a rapidly changing international context. Dr. Cary Fraser is an associate professor of government and justice studies at the Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina. His research and publications focus on U.S. foreign policy and domestic politics, decolonization in the global context after 1945, religion and politics in the Middle East, and the history and politics of the Caribbean and the Atlantic world. He is currently a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Transatlantic Studies. Dr. Fraser is the author of Ambivalent Anti-Colonialism, The United States and the Genesis of West Indian Independence, and his articles and essays have been published in Canada, the Caribbean, the United Kingdom, and the USA. Dr. Fraser delivered the 31st annual Eric Williams Memorial Lecture, Chaguaramas and Caribbean Identity, Exploring the Diplomatic Legacy of Williams, sponsored by the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago in September 2017. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to invite Dr. Fraser to the podium to deliver his lecture this afternoon. Welcome, Dr. Fraser.
Thank you, Dr. Montoot. Thank you all for being here. I'm very, I'm very happy to be here at the invitation of Jessica. As she mentioned, we were here together at the Institute, and I'm sorry that Anna Romero is not here today, but I'll probably see her tomorrow. We were all here at the same time, and the late Dr. Ferguson, who had served here, was also a colleague of ours, and we had established a very good relationship over the years in Geneva, and I think all of us in our own ways have sought to ensure that the Institute both continues the tradition that produced us, but more important, to ensure that it will be a catalyst for the region. I have always held the view that the Institute was a very fascinating decision or I should say, there was a very fascinating decision to establish the Institute here in Trinidad that was undertaken by Dr. Eric Williams. And it was after the Cuban Missile Crisis. He recognized that the Cold War had come to the Caribbean, and he knew how vulnerable the Caribbean was. And out of that insight, he went to the Swiss, who had a long tradition of neutrality, to help establish the Institute, because he was determined to, in some sense, try to find a way that Caribbean diplomacy for the newly independent states could be isolated from the Cold War. Unfortunately, that did not happen, and that sets the context of some of my remarks this afternoon. I think I should start by saying, I'll start this talk in 1986. A couple of months after I had gone to Cornell University on a visiting fellowship, I was invited to a conference in Virginia by the Social Science Research Council, where there was an extended discussion of the future of the study of international relations and the workings of the international order. The conference was organized to explore the radical changes that the elevation of Mikhail Gorbachev to the presidency in the Soviet Union meant for the relationship between the major post-1945 alliance systems that had shaped the Cold War, NATO, and the Warsaw Pact. 30 years later, in 2016, with the arrival of Donald Trump to the presidency, I found myself looking at the internal and external crisis of political legitimacy that has overtaken the United States since his accession to office. In effect, the other major holder of the Cold War bipolar order now confronts the limits of its influence on the global stage and the internal political disarray that arises from that predicament, just as the Soviet Union had to do after 1986. As a consequence of these developments over the last 3 decades, we are now looking at a major transition from the international order, which had emerged in the early 19th century, dominated by Europe and the North Atlantic region, to an emerging order that will increasingly be centered around the Asia-Pacific region in the 21st century. One of the ironies of the current transition from a European and North Atlantic system to an Asia-centric system is that both the USSR and the USA came to grief in Afghanistan, a relatively isolated Asian country, at the periphery of the international system for an extended period. It enjoys the distinction of being a country that can be invaded but cannot be conquered, an attribute that both superpowers failed to understand when they sent their military forces into the country. In offering these observations about the recent era and the changes in the international order that have emerged, I would suggest that the Caribbean governments, which have been heirs to the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, the oust of the Jagan government in British Guiana in 1964, the Dominican intervention in 1965, the destabilization of Jamaica under the Manley government in the late 1970s, the military invasion of Grenada in 1983, and the long-term American and other international interventions in Haiti since the 1990s. These states have been conditioned to recognize their vulnerabilities in the hemispheric and wider global order. In sum, there is a fundamental predicament for regional governments. They live within the geostrategic and policy periphery of the United States, and they will need to think seriously about the future of the region in a changing international context where American influence in the international system is on the wane. In this evolving context, it might be useful to remember the observation made by the 19th century Mexican leader Porfirio Díaz, who said, "Poor Mexico, so far from God and so close to the United States." In the contemporary context, Puerto Rico, an American commonwealth which enjoys a peculiar status, a political oddity which is populated by American citizens who do not have the right to vote, except if they move to one of the 50 states in the Union, which illustrates the contingencies of the Caribbean context. In effect, people who populate the entire Caribbean region live within an American twilight zone and are considered as either peripheral or a threat to the USA. In this context, the region and its leaders are required to display considerable sensitivity to American priorities and policies without a reciprocal commitment by the USA to their sensitivities and well-being. It is this Caribbean dilemma that will have to be faced by the region's leaders as the international system becomes increasingly centered around an Asia-Pacific strategic core over the next 3 decades. For the Caribbean region, and especially for the CARICOM states, I would suggest that there is a need to accelerate the transition in thinking about the future of the region for the next generation of regional leaders. It will be important for Caribbean states at both individual and collective levels to explore the ways in which the Association of Southeast Asian States, founded in 1967, developed the consensus that created effective institutional mechanisms of regional collaboration in the aftermath of the US-Vietnam War, the Vietnamese military intervention in Cambodia, and the brief China-Vietnam War of 1979. In contemporary context, Myanmar continues to be a serious problem, and it will be interesting to see the evolution of the crisis that it has created with the expulsion of the Rohingya Muslim population. However, the larger issue is the way in which the growth of Chinese military and economic power since 1979, as well as its recent claims in the South China Sea, will challenge and perhaps change the military and strategic dynamic in the East Asian region. The parallels between the South China Sea and the Caribbean Basin can provide another avenue for exploring, in comparative context, the ways in which smaller regional states can devise effective strategies for negotiating and/or managing the presence of major powers and the tensions among them in these regions. I'm pursuing this line of argument for comparisons between the Caribbean and Southeast Asian regions because there's a broader context that I think should inform the issue of US-Caribbean relations in the contemporary context. In the early 20th century, in the aftermath of the Spanish-American War in 1898, American policymakers systematically sought to expand their influence over the Caribbean Basin and Central America to secure investment opportunities and to establish an exclusive sphere of influence for America and its naval security concerns, including exclusive control over the Panama Canal. This process continued into the post-1945 period, when the British colonies in the Caribbean sought their political independence from the United States as the process of decolonization of the European empires gained momentum. And the new states in the region sought to redefine their relationship with the wider world under the watchful eye of the United States and its North Atlantic Treaty Organization partners. The Chinese focus on expanding its influence in the South China Sea in the 21st century mirrors the activities of the US in the 20th century Caribbean. Further, in the contemporary context, China as an emerging global power may be using the current Venezuelan crisis as a calibrated strategy for coordinating policy with Russia vis-à-vis the US in the latter's historic sphere of influence. A tactical entente for Russian and Chinese mutual support for Cuba at the northern end of the Caribbean and Venezuela at the southern end provides these extra-regional powers a relatively inexpensive way to paint a negative image of the United States in the wider international system and disrupt American approaches to resolving issues amongst the American states. In effect, the Caribbean continues to provide an avenue for great power competition in the 21st century, as it did in the Venezuelan crisis of the early 20th century, which led to the US assertion of the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. This is the quote from the Roosevelt Corollary, if every country washed by the Caribbean Sea should show the progress in stable and just civilization, which with the aid of the Platt Amendment Cuba has shown since our troops left the island, and which so many of the republics in both Americas are constantly and brilliantly showing, all question of interference by this nation with their affairs would be at an end. Our interests and those of our southern neighbors are in reality identical. They have great natural riches, and if within their borders the reign of law and justice obtains, prosperity is sure to come to them. While they thus obey the primary laws of civilized society, they may rest assured that they will be treated by us in a spirit of cordial and helpful sympathy. We would interfere with them only in the last resort, and then only if it became evident that their inability or unwillingness to do justice at home and abroad had violated the rights of the United States or had invited foreign aggression to the detriment of the entire body of American nations. In asserting the Monroe Doctrine, in taking such steps as we have taken in regard to Cuba, Venezuela, and Panama, and in endeavoring to circumscribe the theater of war in the Far East and to secure the open door in China, we have acted in our own interests as well as in the interests of humanity at large. In the early 20th century, the United States was clearly articulating through Roosevelt the vision of itself as a global power. It's a very interesting part of the Roosevelt Doctrine, the Roosevelt Corollary, that has never really been satisfactorily explored. But in the contemporary context, in the context of Chinese behavior, one of the questions that has to be asked is whether they are also reasoning the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine to in fact negate the effort of the United States to keep China from becoming a player in the Western Hemisphere. This reference to China and the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine was a remarkable extension of the American vision of itself as a guardian angel of civilization, which has permeated American policy rhetoric over the course of the 20th century, and which has had long-term ramifications for the US-China relationship. There has been a pronounced tendency among policymakers to see China through the lens of the post-1945 era, where it emerged as a threat. Once the Chinese Communist Party triumphed in the Chinese Civil War over the Kuomintang faction of the Chinese nationalist movement, that had been America's preference for eventual leadership of a reunified China. However, we should recognize that the American relationship with China had become a major problem after the Versailles Peace Conference held in the wake of World War I. In their effort to punish Germany, the key architects of that agreement decided to transfer the German concessions in Shandong province to Japan. On May 4, 1919, Chinese students in Beijing launched protests against the Chinese government's acceptance of the decision and forced a reversal of the government's position, leading it to refuse to sign the peace accord with Germany. The May 4 movement that arose from these protests triggered the wider challenge to the Chinese imperial system and proved to be the catalyst for the emergence of both the Kuomintang Party and the Chinese Communist movement, which pursued different strategies of political reform, leading eventually to the Chinese Civil War. The Civil War later paved the way for the establishment of Taiwan as a separate state with the support of the US after the Kuomintang lost the Civil War in 1949. The protests began in 1990, and 30 years later, in 1949, the Chinese communists had reunified China with the exception of Taiwan. Taiwan today lives under the umbrella of American power and has sought to establish itself as an independent state, though that status is not necessarily accepted widely. The Communist Party, which today rules the Chinese mainland, continues to assert its claim to Taiwan. And in a sense, what is particularly important is that America has been central to the creation of the modern Chinese dilemma of, from the communist perspective, an incomplete state, and from the Taiwanese perspective, an effort to assert increasing independence from China. So China and America's relationship is very deeply intertwined across the 20th century. And this is something that we in the Caribbean will have to face, both in terms of the Roosevelt Corollary, as well as in terms of the wider conflict that is emerging between America and China. I make this point because one of the interesting events of the, or I should say movements of the recent years has been the question of, since 1979, the rise of China, which was articulated under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping in the late 20th century through the articulation of a peaceful rise strategy. But what I want to go back to is 1919, the May 4th movement, 1949, the reunification of China. 1979, Deng Xiaoping opens to the West. 2009, China is the second largest economy in the world. In 30-year cycles, China has transformed itself. I think this is something that needs to be kept in mind. Is this serendipity, or is it a process of a transfer of intergenerational leadership culture within China? One of the things that has always been very complex about Chinese politics is what precisely do the congresses of the Communist Party establish. One of the things I would suggest is that there has been a larger measure of continuity in terms of China's transformation that has been missed by many outsiders to Chinese politics. And that is something that needs to be looked at. To what extent, in fact, has China's vision of itself after 1919 increasingly been done through an intergenerational process of leadership formation through the Communist Party? Their capacity to build institutional structures is something that is extraordinary. And if one of the things that interested me when I visited Taiwan several years ago was actually seeing that it was not just the Chinese communists, but also the nationalists. They were doing the same thing. Through their political system, every generation of leaders was being schooled about how to take the society into the future. And it is a very fascinating process. So I think it's particularly important to think about the Chinese transformation from 1919 to now and recognize that they have built into their political culture the anticipation of the future. And the question that will emerge for the international system as a whole will be, what is the next generation going to be after 2039? And how are they going to think about the international system? I think we in the Caribbean perhaps also need to think about how to build the institutional structures to do this kind of thinking. Now, what is particularly important in this context is that through this brief excursion into history of the international system, the shift with the growing influence of the Asia-Pacific region in the global order, Caribbean leaders will need to think about what are the implications of again being marginalized in the changing structures of the international system. For most of the Cold War, with the exception of Cuba, the Caribbean became a backwater. I think it is something that if we are going to be able to escape, we have to think about how the ASEAN states have in fact dealt with the rise of China and the retreat of America, about the terms under which we seek to assert and continue our own independent political trajectory. And I think this is part of the issue I'd suggest, that we need to think about the comparative politics of Southeast Asia and the Caribbean in the shadows of great powers and think systematically about strategies for dealing with these issues. Now, this is something that I think is also important. In 1919, the Versailles Treaty, with the leadership of Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, sought to set the terms of the wider international system for the 20th century. One of the critical issues is whether the American political leadership now is capable of doing that. What we are looking at is over the course of a century, the US became the dominant power in the international system because of the quality of the leadership that it had in 1919. In 2020, serious questions now arise, and we need to think about these issues very systematically because we still live close to the United States of America. What I would also point to, and this is something that is particularly important, and it's at one of the key concerns of my talk, is that Donald Trump has explicitly decided to retreat from a leadership role in the international system. He still seeks to exercise influence, but he's not interested in exercising leadership. And that's an important shift in American thinking that has implications across the entire international system. And we need to recognize that. I'd say that Trump's America First rhetoric and his systematic alienation of America's major alliance partners in NATO, as well as the trade war that he has initiated with China, have combined to provide evidence that American politics has entered a period of unpredictability, which will open the way for increasing Chinese influence across the international system. Trump's choice to confront America's European partners over the financing of NATO, his courtship of Vladimir Putin, his initiation of a trade war with China while trying to negotiate with North Korea over its nuclear arsenal and missiles, and pursuing a strategy of escalating conflict with Iran while ceding strategic influence to Russia in the Middle East, reflect the incoherence that has contributed to the destabilization of the contemporary international system. One of the questions that is increasingly emerging after Trump's impeachment is whether, in fact, any successor will be able to recover lost ground in the international system. And I think this is important for people in the Caribbean to think about very systematically. Trump's strategic incoherence in international affairs, in a context of deep political polarization within the US, had been prefigured by the fundamental issue in American politics, the growing power of the presidency in the American constitutional order at the expense of the Congress. In the almost 2.5 centuries of America's existence, there have been 4 impeachment proceedings mounted against a sitting president, and 3 of them have been mounted within the last half century: Nixon, Clinton, and Trump. Impeachment is a congressional tool that is used to challenge and constrain any excesses by the president for the abuse of presidential power. The fact that there has been a resort to this tool so frequently in the last half century is one indication of the political dysfunction that informs the contemporary American political order. And these multiple constitutional crises have contributed to increasing domestic conflict and polarization. In interesting ways, the resort to impeachment reflects dysfunction within the American democratic process and system. And 3 impeachment processes in less than half a century are indicative of the level of intellectual incoherence at work. I would suggest that this incoherence arose from the crisis of the American racial order, which the rise of the civil rights movement provoked in the 1960s. John F. Kennedy, the only Catholic ever elected to the presidency, was assassinated in Texas in 1963 after he began the process of promoting the legislation that would ultimately become the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In the 1968 presidential election, Richard Nixon reached out to the disgruntled Southerners who were deeply resentful that Kennedy's successor, Lyndon Johnson, the first Southern president since the Civil War, had essentially repudiated the Jim Crow regime by supporting these legal initiatives. In 1968, Nixon was able to re-engineer the alignment of American politics by using the political resentment of Southern conservatives as a platform for building a national conservative coalition that has dominated American politics for much of the past 52 years. Thus, the root of the current polarization in American politics dates to the 1968 election campaign around the volatile issue of the reform of the politics of race. For every Republican president since 1968, Nixon's Southern strategy has provided a launch pad for entry into the White House, and Trump has been the most vocal and vigorous champion of that strategy since Nixon. The Republican focus upon reversing the equal rights rhetoric and policy regime of the 1960s has gained increasing momentum in recent years. The Republican Party's focus upon limiting Barack Obama to one term in office had failed by 2012, and Trump's entry into the Republican pool of candidates provided an opportunity and momentum for the Republican Party to accelerate their efforts to adopt hardline positions on immigration and voter suppression. The largest American minority group today is composed of people of Hispanic origin, both immigrants and the descendants of earlier immigrants. And the current campaign against migrants and refugees from Central America has demonstrated the level of desperation that the demographic shift has triggered within American politics. There is also under consideration an effort to restrict or increase restrictions on immigration from Muslim countries and Africa, including Nigeria. The increasing diversity in the American electorate and its wider population has emerged as a serious challenge to white supremacist constituencies in American life, and has begun to intensify the desperation and sense of siege among supporters of the Republican Party. Trump's election campaign and the silence of Republicans in the face of his rhetorical excesses during and after that campaign have created unease about the future direction of American politics, both at home and abroad. He has suffered the misfortune of being impeached in his first term, and his lack of expertise in foreign policy set the stage for that fate. The hostility to immigrants from Central America, Africa, and the Middle East has set the tone of American politics for his tenure and will limit the American capacity to reassert a leadership role within the international system. Further, having been impeached for a foreign policy blunder on the volatile issue of Ukraine within the shifting boundaries of intra-European politics, Trump's credibility in foreign affairs will be questionable for the duration of his presidency. I should say one thing about Ukraine, which does not get much discussed in the Western press. Ukraine is the frontier between Catholic and Orthodox populations in Europe. The eastern Ukraine is predominantly Orthodox. The western Ukraine is predominantly Catholic. Trump does not understand the significance of growing religious conflict in Eastern Europe. In a way, he is repeating the mistakes of Bill Clinton, who failed to understand the religious politics driving the division of Yugoslavia at the end of the Cold War. The increasing diversity in the American electorate and its wider population has emerged, Trump and the Republican Party have forged an axis of xenophobic sentiment within American politics that seeks to restore a political order that was undermined in the 1960s, but which has now been revived in an effort to make America great again. In some ways, this is a repeat performance of post-Civil War history, with the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments of the American Constitution. African Americans were thereafter considered citizens, and the men were granted the right to vote. However, in 1896, 3 decades after the end of the Civil War, the Supreme Court issued the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, which provided the institutional, intellectual, and constitutional sanction of segregation. It took another 58 years before Brown versus the Board of Education to reverse that current of American politics. I think this is something that is particularly important to keep in mind because the Republicans have emerged as the champions of a restoration of various forms of segregation in American life. And Trump has been the second president in the United States in the last 2 decades who won the presidency, but without a majority of the popular vote. George Bush was the first, Trump is the second. Like Bush, Trump faces the dilemma of being a president with a limited electoral mandate and lacking the capacity to engage strategically with the international system and other centers of influence therein. In this context, the growing power of China, which is helping to propel the rise of an Asia-Pacific-centered international system, amidst the reality of American strategic incoherence and questionable commitments to the post-Cold War international system that it helped to fashion, I would suggest that the Caribbean region will have to begin thinking strategically about the terms of its role within and its capacity to exercise influence in the international system. This is where what is striking is that ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nation States, have become important players in fact in helping to use the influence of other powers to help contain the impact of China on their own societies. They have been very strategic about it. And I think this is particularly important. What is also important is that the largest Muslim country in the world is in Southeast Asia, Indonesia. And ASEAN has managed to bridge both ideological and religious divides in the effort to contain the rise of China in terms of its impact on their own societies, given the spread of a Chinese diaspora population across much of Southeast Asia. Perhaps it's time for us in the Caribbean to begin thinking about how to use our diaspora populations abroad to effectively build strategies for dealing with the new emerging international order. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fraser. My role here is merely to help you manage the questions. I think what we should try to do maybe is to take, if we can, take a round of questions. So let us see if, and what I would ask you to do is say who you are and then ask your question or questions. Any takers? Who would like to start things off? Let's see if we can get about 3. If not, we just answer them.
Hello. Good afternoon, Dr. Fraser. Thank you for your... Hello? Yes. Thank you. I appreciate your lecture because actually tomorrow I'm doing my oral presentation and it is on, the analysis of U.S. CARICOM relations under Donald Trump. And I noticed that you focus a lot on imitation of China Caribbean. But what I would like to get your opinion on the recent meetings, the meeting that he had last year in Florida with the 5 Caribbean leaders, and the comments that the Honorable Mia Motley made in light of the meeting in Jamaica, in which other CARICOM countries were excluded. So I would appreciate your feedback.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Dr. Fraser. Welcome to the Institute, or welcome back, I should say. We're happy to have you here. I'm a lecturer here, International Law, Global Environmental Governance. My name is Michelle Scobie. Fascinated by your talk. Very provocative. I think very strong directions in some of the ways you're thinking, which I think we all appreciate. I'm particularly interested in what are some of the steps that you would include in thinking strategically in terms of the Caribbean's relationship with China moving forward, and looking at the example of what ASEAN has done in terms of their own thinking strategically in that region? Because I know you mentioned using our diaspora more efficiently, but I think we definitely need a step change in terms of understanding our relationship with China, and I get the impression that it's kind of veiled what you mean by what those steps would mean for CARICOM and for the Caribbean states.
Let me just address the question of the meeting in Jamaica. I think there are several sets of issues that have been long a part of Caribbean regional politics. When I came here in the late 1970s as a student, this was the first time I'd left Guyana and was spending time in another Caribbean society. And one of the jokes that was made on campus was that Jamaica is part of the Caribbean hand, but it's the thumb that is always pointing in a different direction. Right. So this is something I think is important to keep in mind. Jamaican politics has always demonstrated that issue. It was the fight between Jamaica and Trinidad over the question of an oil refinery in Jamaica that led to the collapse of the Federation. So this is something that needs to be understood. But one of the interesting things that I think about Jamaican politics that has not been well understood in terms of the relationship with China is that Jamaica has had an influential Chinese community that plays a significant role in the country's politics, but it's not well understood outside of the society. And that is something that needs to be understood. They came since the 19th century, and they have been part of Jamaican politics. The second thing that I think is particularly important is that both the PNP and the JLP, until the 1970s, were much more closely aligned to the United States and interested in seeking its support for the decolonization, first of Jamaica, but also as a source of investment for the transformation of the Jamaican economy. Jamaica has also exported large numbers of its people, and those diasporas are effective abroad, and it's something that needs to be kept in mind. Jamaica has played the diaspora card in some very interesting ways. In that context, I would say that there are some things that could be learned from the Jamaican experience. But the more important issue in terms of the use of diaspora population, but the more important issue is that Jamaica came to independence in the same year as the Cuban Missile Crisis. And Jamaica understood what were the terms that the Americans were seeking to impose on the Caribbean. And they adjusted themselves to it. But the more important issue is that in the 1970s, Jamaica's society was in fact rapidly damaged by the by the intervention of the Americans in Jamaica's domestic politics and the overthrow or the ouster of Manley's party. I think it's important to understand that of all of the English-speaking territories outside of Trinidad, Jamaica has always been seen much more strategically, or seen in different strategic terms by the United States. And it has always been a point of entry for America's policies into the region. So we shouldn't be surprised by the Jamaica meeting. It's a long pattern, a tradition within American-Jamaican relations and Jamaica's relationship with the Caribbean. The critical issue, I would argue, is that it is time for the Caribbean states to find, and particularly the Anglophone Caribbean states, to find a way to use Jamaica to influence American politics. One of the most important movers and shakers in American politics in the 1960s was Harry Belafonte, a Jamaican, who raised money for Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement. Jamaicans in the United States have actively been involved in American politics, and it's time for Caribbean political leaders and other influentials to think systematically about how to use the Caribbean community inside of the United States as a way of influencing politics. Does that make sense?
Those you responded to both questions in that statement, I think. I wanted to add a couple more comments until a few more questions come along. Well, two sort of questions and comments. Dr. Fraser, you focused on the two things have been bothering me a little bit in your talk, and I wanted you to elaborate a bit on them. You've kept speaking about the Caribbean, but of course the Caribbean is a very diverse region with several different elements and actors within it, for all of whom the political dynamics in the United States are very important, and there's tremendous economic and other dependence on the United States. But we seldom speak, English-speaking Caribbean countries do not really entertain dialogue with Panama about Panamanian perspectives on the United States and China. Yet, Panama has a very important perspective. Neither, for that matter, do we speak that much to the Dominican Republic, except to trade insults. So, what sort of region do we really have, and don't we make it much easier for the United States to deepen the fragmentation within this region? That's the first thing.
Mm-hmm.
Second thing is there really, well, it's a continuation of that. There are national Caribbean diasporas in the United States. Now, you may disagree with me. You're a member of the diaspora yourself, in one sense. But how often do English-speaking Caribbean countries, to start with, really act as if we have a regional diaspora to whom we should respond as a region? I find that the diasporic discourse is more a national diasporic discourse, and so we lose out on a lot of the strategic leverage that we could gain from the diaspora. Basically, that's it.
All right. There are two sets of issues. There's tremendous diversity in the region, but I would make the argument that a part of the problem is the way we train our political leaders. They are not taught to think strategically. They are taught to think opportunistically. Let me be blunt about it. For them, politics is about opportunity. It is not about strategy. if we are going to be taken seriously at the international level, we have to focus on developing a strategic framework for the region. That's the first point. The second one that I think is particularly important is one of the things that struck me, because I have relatives in Canada and the United States, so I moved between Canada and the United States over the last 30 years fairly frequently. And one of the things that has struck me is the transformation of the Caribbean Festival in Toronto, where in the 1980s, it was primarily Trinidadian. Last year I was there. It's amazing what is going on in terms of the way in which these communities are now interacting in a much more interesting way. And in that kind of context, it's probably a matter of time. But one of the things that the governments in this region need to think about systematically is how to use those cultural festivals of the diaspora population to actually get access to, in serious terms, not just about music and costumes, but thinking strategically about how to use them for political purposes in those societies. Many of the diaspora populations in North America, whether it's Canada or the United States, if they do not have home state support, cannot get access to politics in some interesting ways. So we have, the governments in the region have to think strategically about these issues.
I am piggybacking on something that Dr. Byron said. When I was in London, I recall there was a matter that affected all of the CARICOM states and some of the African states. This was the environmental tax that was added to travel by air. And in order to balance interference in the domestic affairs of the United Kingdom with seeking the interests of all of these national diasporic bodies, the consuls general all got together, including some of those from the African states affected, and made their intervention through that group, because it was an internal political matter. So it goes back to what you're talking about, that institutional strengthening, and specifically the training of diplomats, and all, including your heads of mission, to have that kind of thinking going and to exploit the opportunities that arise, which frequently arise as challenges.
Let me just put it, sorry, I just want to add in something. The question of Caribbean vulnerability to climate change provides a wonderful opportunity, given the European focus on climate change, for us in the region to think systematically about how to use this as national strategies within the region and as a regional initiative, but also how to use it to influence publics in the major northern countries, particularly the Europeans and the Canadians, because unlike the US, they want to deal with climate change. One of the most interesting things that I've realized in the United States is that after Hurricane Katrina, when the vulnerabilities of the entire coastal system of dealing with floods in that state collapsed under the impact of Katrina, one of the interesting things that happened is that the United States did not go to the country that has the best ocean coastal management systems in the world, the Dutch. The Army Corps of Engineers rebuilt the system. It's going to fail within 30 years. The Dutch have moved far ahead. There's a large Surinamese diaspora in the Netherlands. I grew up in Guyana where the Dutch had built the dike system. I'm familiar with what they did and how that helps the coastal plain of Guyana to survive. My position is very simply, there should be an initiative within the Caribbean to approach the Dutch, to deal with these issues, and use Suriname to lead in that position as a way of creating a base for building on wider climate initiatives that the Europeans are interested in funding. Does that make sense? And that has to be done as a regional initiative. Sorry.
Sorry to grab the floor again, but this is exciting. So I noticed you mentioned the fact that what we are seeing today in global politics in terms of China's involvement is a consequence of generations of leadership in the same strategic direction. I don't mean to be a pessimist. My area of focus is governance. And one of the challenges I find with our region is precisely because our governments think very in short-term 5-year cycles as a consequence of democracy, I guess. So am I too much of a pessimist to suggest that if we continue with a democratic state, we will not achieve development in the Caribbean and maybe a more unified autocratic? I'm not suggesting this, but is there a way forward given the cultural and historical reality of the Caribbean to achieve perhaps a more unified focus towards more development?
I think it's particularly important. I went to Switzerland at the Graduate Institute to do my PhD. And coming from a society with 6 different ethnic groups and with high degrees of political polarization, and this is where I began to think about the relationship between religious conflict and state formation. The Dutch at the time, the Swiss at the time of the religious wars provided one of the most important leaders of the Reformation, Zwingli. But today, the Catholic Swiss Guard protects the Pope in Rome. 400 more years later. That society is multi-ethnic. There are Italian speakers, German speakers, French speakers. They sit at the heart of Europe. They were part of one of the most serious conflicts in European history. And out of that process, they have an electoral, it is not democracy in the traditional Western European sense, but what is particularly important is they have both representation and electoral outcomes that determine the shape of the political order. But the most important thing is they have never allowed regional, linguistic, ethnic, or religious identity to in fact triumph over national identity. We don't have that in the Caribbean. And that is a reality that we have to face. And the question is, how do you build it? Part of my interest in the role of religion in Swiss politics was the fact that I worked with the Caribbean Conference of Churches for 3 years before leaving the Caribbean to go up to Europe. And what was interesting for me was actually seeing the experience of dealing with religious communities in the region, and then going to Switzerland and seeing a different pattern of religious experiences and leadership. And that, to me, shaped my understanding of how, in fact, the Caribbean continues to compromise itself. Part of the problem is ethnic politics, part of it is the instability of electoral democracy. But one of the fundamental issues is we have not solved the problem of religious cohabitation.
Something bothers me a little bit in terms of Trinidad and Tobago. Something bothers me a little bit in terms of Trinidad and Tobago. We have a number of seriously thinking persons, young, middle-aged, old, who hold themselves above the fray, who would not be prepared to use various tactics, even guerrilla, to get into the inner workings of the political machinery in the country and to seek to change it from within, who would not necessarily, as a matter of course, do articles in the newspaper that deal with the issues that the politicians really need to be addressing, not necessarily in a pro and con way, but in terms of highlighting what the possibilities are. This is lacking. And how do you build that responsibility? I see it as responsibility within the population, especially those who have the capacity to influence, so that they can see it as their responsibility to get in and do whatever they need to do that is right, that is ethical, and so on, to bring the whole up.
There are two sets of issues embedded in this. One of them, when I came here in the late 70s to Trinidad, one of the things that struck me, and part of the reason I came to Trinidad, was in 1962, I was a child looking at the burning of the capital city, Georgetown, in Guyana, because of racial violence. I was in high school when the Black Power events unfolded here. And the first time I heard a Trinidadian speak was Stokely Carmichael at my high school. Right? He had come to the region. And what was striking for me was that how many people in the Caribbean have ever thought systematically about the fact that Guyana disintegrated in 1962, the year the Federation collapsed, and to what extent the collapse of the Federation was a trigger for the violence that emerged in Guyana. It's a very important issue that needs to be kept in mind. And I say this not lightly, because I grew up in a very interesting family structure. Part of my family is Muslim, part of it is Hindu, and part of it is Christian. And I had to learn to navigate religious difference within the family. And I've always had a different sensibility on religion than most people. And that is something I recognize, because I had to bridge differences. But the familial structure forced me to deal with difference. How much in our society are we saying directly, in our societies, are we saying directly, we are different, and we need to think about how to reach mutual accommodations effectively. One of the other reasons I suggest the Association of Southeast Nation States system as a way of thinking about it, the most successful multicultural state in Southeast Asia is which one? Singapore. In 1960, when Singapore became independent, it was one of the poorest countries in the world. It was in the bottom 5. The leader who led it into independence was Chinese, but he was educated at Oxford, and he grew up with a Confucian background. It was a very interesting cultural polyglot mix that Lee Kuan Yew brought to dealing with the politics of Singapore and the fact that it was a multicultural island. It was one of the poorest countries in the world. Where is Singapore today? Right? And one of the things that is really interesting is that Singapore was in a strategic position in Southeast Asia. It had been the site of the largest naval base outside of Britain in Asia. Lee Kuan Yew understood the way that Singapore's strategic location could allow it to have access to multiple sources of development aid to transform the society. And that legacy has lived on today in Singapore. Have we ever thought in the Caribbean about what our strategic position between North, South America, and Europe means in terms of being able to access resources in order to build these island economies into an effective hub in the international system? All right. That's what the Swiss did. While the religious chaos in Europe went on around them, they transformed their economy to make sure that they would have access to all of the strategic centers within Europe. That's why neutrality is profitable for them, and the banking system. But there's also another part of it that was really striking for me. I went to visit one of these factories where they manufactured musical boxes, you know, the ones that where they have the dancing ballerina. And as the guy was describing the processes that they were working with, I asked him something very interesting. Well, for me, it was interesting. And for him, he reacted in a fashion that to me was striking. I asked him how it was that when they brought in apprentices, they trained them. And he said that in the museum on the factory's premises, there was an example of every type of musical box they had built. And every apprentice who had been brought into that factory would have to spend a year looking at how each of those musical boxes was produced, so that by the time they entered the production line, they understood the evolution of the technology. How much of our educational system actually takes us back to the roots of who we are, where we are, and what we need to do? That is something that I will be very frank about. When I was coming to U.W.I, I had also been admitted into the School of Oriental and African Studies in London because I wanted to study why it is that multicultural societies survive and why Guyana was in itself in a process of disintegration. But then I came to Trinidad, and that helped me to think about Trinidad and Guyana, to think about Guyana and Trinidad in comparative context. And then I began to look at Jamaica. And one of the things that struck me, and was really striking about Jamaica and Barbados began to build tourism economies. How did Jamaica get itself into the predicament it did in the 1970s and 1980s, while Barbados was able to survive and prosper? So thinking about these islands individually and what they represent and their experiences provides a way to think about how you can build institutional structures that accommodate diversity while moving these societies forward. That is the essence of the Caribbean problem, how to accommodate diversity as a mechanism for moving the societies forward. And you have to do it both at the island level as well as within the societies themselves. Does that make sense?
I'm the Indian High Commissioner.
Sorry?
I'm the Indian High Commissioner here in
Okay.
Trinidad and Tobago. Very, very interesting insight that you were giving. I think you gave, I learned a lot. Just to pick your brain on the crisis in Myanmar. how do you see both the Chinese and the Americans playing it, and what is expected out of it?
The problem is twofold. China is detaining more than 1 million Uyghur Muslims right now, right? One of the questions that has to be asked, and this is where the Chinese state is most vulnerable, is the problem of religious difference, which is also about ethnic difference, right? And I think in a very important way, China's influence over Burma's politics since the 1940s. Burma became independent within a short time of the Communist Chinese coming to power. And China, throughout this entire period, has in fact engaged in mass detention of people across the board. And Burma, living so close to China, but also seeing what happened to India when it disintegrated, had to deal with the fact that there are two strategies: expulsion and internment. And they have never gotten beyond that. That's part of the issue. There are two strategies because Burma borders China and India, and that has influenced Burmese politics. No, but a really important issue is that, in fact, that Burma, and this I think is particularly important, the opportunity to build institutional structures after independence in Burma was disrupted by the Vietnam War and the focus on producing heroin and opium, right? That is how Burma survived during the Vietnam War, the drug trade. And that, we are now seeing what is happening in Mexico, right? So this is part of the issue. The drug trade, in fact, cripples the ability to build institutions. I would make the argument that part of the problem that happened in Jamaica after 1979 was the explosion of the drug trade. I'll give you a story because it concerns. I first went to Jamaica in 1979, and that's when I really began to realize the kinds of problems we were facing. I stayed in the house of one of the major drug dealers in Jamaica, and I didn't know. I was sent to him by a friend who had been at the institute with me, and he said, "Well, stay with my friend," so I went. The night before I left, we went out for a drink, and we started talking. And he started talking about the fact that he was facing financial difficulties. He came from a fairly wealthy family, but he'd gone into business on his own account. And he was facing a difficulty because during the mid-70s, he bought a coconut plantation with US dollars, a loan through the IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank. And then the Jamaican dollar got devalued, and he had to repay the loan. And I said, "So what are you going to do? Are you going to sell it?" He said, "No, I'm planting ganja in between the coconut trees." And I said, "What?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "How often you ship?" He said, "Every 3 months or so, I send a container up to Florida." So I said to him, "You send a container up to Florida every 3 months. How do they pay you?" This is 1979 I'm talking about. He said, "Some of it in cash and some of it in guns." And I said to him, "What do you do with guns?" He said, "Sell it to the armed factions in the country." He was selling it to the political gangs. So a part of the problem that has not been really addressed is in fact the way in which the drug trade in Burma, in Jamaica, and a whole list of other countries has destabilized the political systems. And unless there is a sane policy for dealing with these issues, these problems will continue to arise. And these societies cannot solve it themselves. They have to find ways to get outsiders in to help deal with the problem. Now, one of the critical issues, and I'll say this very frankly, is that one of the problems with the growing militarization of American foreign policy during the Cold War and after the Cold War really emerges in the context of what is happening in Afghanistan. When America was involved in Southeast Asia, Burma was the largest exporter of opium and heroin. When the Americans got involved in destabilizing Colombia because of the guerrilla war, and Central America because of the Reagan administration, cocaine exploded. And then the US went into Afghanistan, which is the largest producer of heroin in the world today. Right? So this is something that needs to be thought about. That some of the problems that these societies have encountered need to be addressed not within the context of the institutional structures of the society, but the fact that the external environment creates the conditions for destabilization. And there has to be a two-pronged approach to dealing with these issues. We have to deal with it in the Caribbean. The American demand for drugs in terms of consumption is just extraordinary. And one of the issues that has to be put squarely on the table is if the Americans cannot control their drug problems, what's going to happen to all of these societies surrounding it that have found this as a strategy for survival?
Thank you. Hi, Dr. Fraser. I have a question. I know you spoke briefly about the U.S.-China trade war, and of course, you also highlighted that the U.S. has adopted a different trade strategy for economic dominance. So my question to you is, how do you see the new strategy of the United States as it relates to trade affecting us? Because just this morning, for instance, I read that Trinidad and Venezuela, they signed a joint deal for gas exploration, and that deal has been rescinded. I was informed of it this morning. And our Prime Minister indicated that it was due to the sanctions that were placed on Venezuela. So how much do you think this is really affecting us? Because clearly that will have some negative implications to us. So, yeah, thank you.
Oh, sorry. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you. And I think this is my last intervention. I wanted to make both a comment and also ask a question. On the comment side, I think that your presentation has been a very profound demonstration to all of us of the importance of history and the importance of studying history a lot more than we do. We're becoming increasingly an ahistorical society, but we cannot understand present events without having a very well-informed grasp of what happened in the past. And this is very important in our relations both with China and with the United States and in many other instances. The other thing that I got from what you said relates to, and I'm thinking in terms of curriculum reviews and reforms that we are currently involved in. The importance of renovating the way in which we teach regionalism and doing much more comparative regionalism and interregionalisms. What has always struck me much more about Southeast Asia than their unity is in fact their tremendous divisions and animosities, but they are able to hold them in check and to get beyond them in terms of strategizing and in terms of building basic laws of respect and tolerance in terms of how they deal with each other and how they strategize with the major powers. And I think that in our own study and teaching of regionalism here, we need to look further afield and do more comparative work. But my question is this. In terms of looking at Caribbean relations with the United States in the current period, I was wondering, Cary, what would be your analysis of Guyana, the Southern Caribbean, Guyana, Venezuela, the dynamics of that relationship, and also the role you can see for the United States in the near-term future in the politics of those two societies?
Guyana and Venezuela. Guyana and Venezuela. Well, let me answer this question because it's immediate in my mind. But the critical issue is that the Guyana-Venezuela issue arises out of American efforts to prevent the accession to Guyana of independence under the Jagan regime in the early 1960s. They were determined to have Cheddi Jagan overthrown. And they put pressure on the British to, in fact, reopen the 1899 arbitral award, which had settled the dispute, based on the memoir of an American participant in the deliberations back in the 1890s. It was very contrived, and the British tried to block it, but it was clear that the Americans were not prepared to accept the idea of Guyana's independence under Jagan. As a result of it, the dispute was reactivated in 1962 and has never been resolved. Guyana today is looking at the issue of taking the matter to the International Court of Justice. Now, what is particularly important about this is that since the 1970s, there were preliminary explorations for oil off of Guyana's coast. And my information from senior officials of the Barnum government was that oil had been found by a Canadian company, and the Americans told them, plug it and leave. It was as simple as that. So what has in fact happened, I find it very interesting, that the oil has now been found at a point in time that the Chavez and the Maduro regime have emerged as consistently hostile to the United States. And so the question that really is sitting out there is, to what extent is the Guyana-Venezuela boundary dispute a function of American policy towards these two countries? And this is where the issue will have to be addressed at some levels. Now, the second part of it, though, that is particularly important, and I think this is not something that can be avoided. Now that oil has been found on the Suriname coast, off the Suriname coast, there is going to be a question of how much of the Caribbean basin has even greater deposits of oil than was previously known. I happened to be teaching at Penn State University in the 1990s and 2000s. And at that time, because of the work I was doing, I found out that Penn State, which is one of the leading producers of people who work in petroleum engineering, and they work with the oil companies, were doing drilling for oil off in the Gulf of Guinea at deeper levels than they had ever attempted before. And it seems as if that technology has been developed to the point in time where they could drill at the same level in the Caribbean basin. And that is how the oil was found, quote unquote, off of Guyana and Suriname. So the real issue is getting access to the oil is one set of issues. But if as societies we do not develop the capacity to handle and master the technologies, we will always be on the losing ends of these arrangements. And people can be manipulated on these bases. So one of the questions I have to ask, how many petroleum engineers are being trained in Trinidad? Right. U.W.I used to fund, U.W.I used to run the training program. Has anybody ever replaced, what's his name, Trevor? That's one of the issues I think is particularly important. How many petroleum economists and engineers are there operating within the university system? No. Sorry? Sorry, I can't hear you. He's now working with that. So that became the center of training outside of U.W.I.
Professor Julian is providing.
Right, no, I know. So this is something that needs to be addressed. Sorry, the comment that could you restate your question again? Sorry.
Yeah, I was asked. You spoke about the U.S.-China trade war, and I wanted to ask you what the implications, or even if you look at NAFTA or the current the U.S. policy when it comes to trade and economic dominance, if you wish to say it like that. What do you think the implications of that will be for us? Because I was previously telling you that this morning I read a news article that the joint Trinidad-Venezuela agreement to explore gas has been rescinded because of sanctions that have been placed on Venezuela. So, yeah.
Well, this is part of the issue that I would make an argument now. And I'm very serious about this. One of the things that has happened as a result of the dollar being the reserve currency in the international system, the dollar is also valued, or the pricing mechanism for petroleum. And one of the problems that the United States is grappling with is that the use of the dollar as an international trading currency, but also for the imposition of sanctions in terms of trade, is leading to a situation where people will have to rethink how the financing of debt internationally will take place, or even trading transactions. And I would make the argument that part of the issue that has emerged within the Iranian nuclear accord has to do with the fact that the Europeans are working with Iran to develop an alternative payment mechanism. And that is beginning to create serious concern with the United States. Now, what is particularly important to keep in mind is the last time, or let me put it this way, up until 1974, the US dollar was backed by gold. And then the oil crisis hit. And they had to come off the gold standard. But they also had to come off the gold standard because the cost of the Vietnam War had gone out of control. What we have now is a situation where the United States war against terror has gone out of control. And the fundamental problem is that there is instability in currency markets because of the American use of sanctions using the dollar payment mechanisms. So people are going to start thinking about how to get out of that system. So in terms of future trading relationships, I would argue that the Caribbean, given the differences in the values of the currencies that we use across the region, if we are going to go for a single payment mechanism, should be negotiated with every payment partner, not in US dollars. Does that make sense? And I would make the argument, however much people might want to say about questions of recolonization, I would say that at this point in time, if we are going to look for serious partners that could help address the issues that the regions are facing, I would go with the Europeans above the Americans. I have no apology for saying that, because they have to deal with a similar problem, right? But their understanding of the issue is much more sophisticated, because they have used the euro as the denominator of trade within the euro bloc. So they have an understanding of dealing with variability in currency rates that the Americans simply don't have.
I have a feeling that we have run out of questions. We not going to subject you any longer to a continuous stream of questions, because you have so adequately answered all those that we raised, and we are also still trying to digest at least half of what you said to us initially, Dr. Fraser. So at this point in time, in addition to thanking you myself for all that you have offered to us this afternoon, I would like to ask Usha Lakan, one of our recent alumni, to come forward and to thank you on our behalf, and also to make a small presentation to a slightly more senior alumnus of the...
Thanks.
Dr. Fraser, on behalf of the Institute of International Relations, I would like to present you with a small token of appreciation.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Somebody wants me to talk more if I'm going to drink this. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk with you. It always is a pleasure to be back in the region at one level, but the second part of it, that it's always for me a pleasure to be here, because as I had to say a couple of years ago, coming to Trinidad in 1977 opened me to the Caribbean and the wider world beyond Guyana. And one of the things that I really enjoyed about that experience, being here for 2 years, was that I was exposed to people who made me think well beyond the limits of the society in which I had grown up. And that's what has informed my entire educational process. The more I've traveled, the more my mind has been opened up. And what is also something very important, and I say it because I established a relationship with one of the most important intellectuals that the Caribbean produced, Lloyd Best from Trinidad. And I say that because this is where he taught me, and where he served as my advisor for my master's thesis. One of the things that I always remember when he came into the class, the first thing he said is, "Let me explain to you, I do not believe in orthodoxy. My point," and he went on to say, "I have revised orthodoxies, including my own," which was an interesting point of view. He was a remarkable intellectual. And that group of teachers with Lloyd, Leslie Maniga, who was then the director of the Institute, and others, Horbado and others, what it did for me was that within the context of this institute, I met people from all across the region. I was exposed to people who were both Caribbean and non-Caribbean. But more important than that, this was an institute that I've always believed should be central to the development of a Caribbean tradition of diplomacy. And that is something that needs to be consistently worked at. The world has changed. We were operating in the 1970s with a curriculum that had been derived from Europe. The world has changed much beyond Europe. We need to think about how to build curricula in the region that will allow us to engage with societies well beyond this region. And that's part of the reason I suggested thinking about the comparative study of the ASEAN region. Because Asia will help will be the critical factor in shaping the future. So thank you all for being an interested and interesting audience. All right, thanks again. Oh, you have something else?
Yeah,
Oh, sorry.
So I'd like to do a brief vote of thanks. Again, on behalf of the Institute of International Relations, we would like to sincerely thank you for the time you have taken to really come and do this special lecture on U.S.-Caribbean relations in a rapidly changing international context. The historical and current analysis of the Caribbean relationship with the United States was comprehensive and enlightening. Of course, it was very clear that the Caribbean needs to strategically think of its relationship with great powers, especially with the rise of an Asia-Pacific centric system. I'd also like to thank Your Excellencies, ambassadors, members of the Diplomatic Corps, and members of the U.W.I community, students, staff members, and other persons for attending this event. Thank you very much and have a pleasant afternoon.
Thanks again. Should I lubricate my throat?
Thanks again,
No
Cary.
problem. That's
That
fine.
concludes this afternoon's lecture. Please help yourselves to water, tea, or coffee if you would like, and have a safe return home. And for those of you who have classes,